Before I begin, I would like to issue a warning. This video will contain graphic details that may not be suitable for all watchers. With that out of the way, let's jump into it. Most criminals are not born, they're made. William Randolph Hearst. Have you ever seen Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho or perhaps the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Are you aware that these two Hollywood horrors are inspired by a real-life killer? Ed Gein is known as one of the most gruesome murderers in human history despite only of killing two people that we know of. As someone who enjoys both true crime and horror movies, I was interested to see just what type of human could inspire these characters. The 3 articles, 1 book, and 1 research paper later, I had my answer. To be fully able to understand the crimes and why they had been committed, we must first understand Ed himself. Edward Theodore Gein was born to George and Augusta Gein on August 27th in 1906. George was an abusive alcoholic and Augusta was a fanatically religious woman. Their marriage had lost all love. They had lived in La Crosse, Wisconsin for the first 8 years of his life. It was here that he had seen his parents slaughter a pig and emitted semen at the age of 7. In 1914, the family had moved to Plainfield, Wisconsin. Growing up, Ed had a hard time at school and at home. In a schoolhouse consisting of 12 students, Ed was bullied because he was shy and had a lazy eye and smoked odd. When he had come home crying, his father would beat him in the head until his ears would ring. His mother would constantly tell him about the sins of man and the sins of flesh, and how all females in towns were harlots. She had made Ed and his brother Henry, who was 5 years older, promise to always be virgins. When Ed was 12, his mother caught him pleasuring himself in the bathtub and responded by grabbing his genitals and calling them the curse of man, according to research conducted by students of Rutherford University titled Edward Theodore Gein, American Psycho. Both brothers grew up listening to their mother constantly belittle their father and their father physically assault their mother. In 1940, Ed's father died at the age of 66 due to pneumonia, and the boys began taking odd jobs. Ed took many jobs as a babysitter. The townspeople trusted him, and he enjoyed the company of children because they were easier to relate to. Henry began to criticize their mother, which made Ed frustrated because he was the favorite, according to a book Ed Gein, Psycho by Paul Anthony Woods. When Henry remarked on the unhealthy attachment Ed had to his mother, he became mortified. Not long after, Henry died in a runaway bush fire in 1944. Ed claimed he couldn't find Henry, but would later lead police directly to the body. What's more, upon inspection of the body, it was discovered that it had not been burned, but rather the head was severely bruised, and the cause of death was ruled to be asphyxiation. Despite how it looked, Ed was not convicted of murder because no one believed he was capable of killing. After Henry's death, Augusta fell ill and died a few months later in 1945. After this, Ed became more of a recluse. He boarded up his mother's sitting room and bedroom to be preserved as sort of a museum. As time passed, he and the house had fallen to squalor. He had boarded up all but 2 rooms, the kitchen and a small bedroom beside it. There were details. This is where details get graphic, so viewer discretion is advised. After 18 months, Ed began to visit his mother's grave. Several visits later, he dug up her body and took her head, which he would later shrink as he had learned from books. Finding a hobby in the exhumation of graves, he began to consistently visit cemeteries at night, 40 of them to be exact. He took the body parts of at least 9 women that he had found in obituaries, and while never having been physically intimate with the bodies because they smelled too bad, he had pleasured himself. Due to this, he was categorized as a necrophiliac. 6 years after his mother's death, Ed became interested in Mary Hogan, a local bar owner who resembled his mother. 3 years later, Mary had gone missing. 3 years after that, Bernice Worden had gone missing too. It was then that the local law enforcement began to suspect Ed because he was the last person to see Bernice. Deputy Frank Worden, Bernice's son, had gone to Ed's house to question him. Upon entering the shed, Deputy Frank had found his mother. This next part is not for the faint of heart or stomach, so I advise you to proceed with caution. Bernice was hanging upside down by her feet, with no head and a deep cut running from between her legs to her sternum. After further investigation, authorities found many horrific things. Ed had made gloves of human skin, a lampshade from a face, bowls from skulls, a suit of flesh, complete with a belt of breasts, and a corset made out of a human torso. There had also been dining utensils made from human bone and a chair made with skin, as reported by Alison Maloney in the article titled The Real Psycho, published on the U.S. Sun. The examining psychiatrist at Ed Gein's trial, Dr. Martin Miller, said his activities were the result of a split-level consciousness. In his conscious mind, his mother was as good a woman as it was possible for a person to be. The hatred he felt on account of her mistreatment of him was pushed onto another woman who reminded him, in appearance or situation, of her. As word of this appearing scene spread, writers became inspired. Just 2 years after Ed had been caught, Robert Bloch released Psycho. The main character, Norman Bates, had been heavily inspired by Ed. After his mother had died, Norman dug up her body and kept it in the house. He would dress in his mother's clothing and would become her, complete with her tone of voice and screaming. His mother had also taught him to be wary of females, that pleasures of flesh was a horrible sin. Norman had preserved her room, much like Ed. Another character inspired by these gruesome crimes was Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The character would wear masks made of faces of his victims to cover a facial deformation. Some significant differences between the two are the method of killing, the number of kills, and the familiar status. Ed had shot both of his victims in the head, limiting their suffering, whereas Leatherface had no such decency. He left one of his victims impaled on a meat hook for hours till one of the victim's friends put him out of his misery. Another distinction is Ed had only confessed to killing 2 people, Mary and Bernice. Leatherface has killed at least 3 people, making him a serial killer. As for the family status, Ed began killing after his family had died. Leatherface was able to kill with the help of his family. A very important detail is that in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the family appears close. In more recent times, Ed continues to be a blueprint for characters. Most recently, in Season 2 of American Horror Story, there is a character named Dr. Oliver Thredson, who has been obviously inspired by Ed. Dr. Oliver kills women and uses their body parts for home decor, such as a lampshade made of breast and a candy bowl made of skull. In the 1991 film Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill is a character that skins his female victims. The goal of this fictional character is to make a suit of women so that they may finally be able to transition from male to female. In conclusion, Ed Gein will definitely be remembered as more than just a small town boy. Because the horrific details of his crimes have captivated the nation, he will forever be remembered as one of the most gruesome criminals in all of history. The seeds of destruction were sowed at a young age from all the abuse he had endured. Finally, when the last member of his family died, so had the last bit of his sanity. The product of such horrible deeds is the muse for many authors. Now, whenever you watch any of these films, you can tell your friends the despicable details of which they are based. Perhaps, if it weren't for the brokenness of his parents, Ed would have been a wonderful man with a wonderful life.